This is Declarations.
There's a certain amount of dream in all entrepreneurs, right? So how much of this is a dream and how much of this is somebody who has figured out how you're going to get there? I tend to like people who have given thought to themselves and the skill sets in others that complement who they are, right? And how are they going to build a team and build success? Because that's fundamental and that's critical.
Hi, this is Todd Rich, and welcome to the Declarations podcast. The purpose of this podcast is to engage with thought leaders in investing who provide an independent perspective. Our goals are to explore the foundations behind their success, to understand the source of their inspiration, and through these conversations, to become better investors. We hope you enjoy this episode. We're excited to welcome Michael Spies to today's podcast. Michael is a visionary leader at the intersection of global real estate and technology. He currently serves as the managing partner of Fuse Strategies, where he advises and invests in early-stage companies transforming the built environment. He's also a venture partner at Navitas Capital, one of the leading prop tech-focused venture capital firms. Michael brings over 3 decades of experience from Tishman Speyer, where he served in key global leadership roles, including chair of the Global Investment Committee, and was instrumental in expanding the firm's footprint across Europe and India. When I lived in London, I used to report to Michael, and I grew tremendously under his tutelage. During Michael's tenure at Tishman Speyer, he served as the first ever head of innovation and launched groundbreaking innovation platforms like Zoe and Studio, aimed at reimagining workplace experiences and flexibility. Beyond the private sector, Michael has deep roots in public service, having served as Executive Vice President of New York City's Public Development Corporation. He currently serves on the board of Harvard Kennedy School's Taubman Center and champions creative placemaking through programs like ULI's Art in Place. From global strategy to startup ecosystems and community-driven development, Michael brings a rare blend of operational depth and forward-thinking vision. Michael is a member of the Declaration Partners Real Estate Advisory Board, and I am proud that he has chosen to invest his time and his capital with us. I'm even more proud to call him a friend and a mentor. I've learned so much from Michael over the years, and I'm confident that you will too. Michael, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Todd. Glad to be here.
Well, as you know, Michael, we named our business after the Declaration of Independence. And I view that as a document that lays out the foundation for American society, as well as our aspirations for the future. So, Michael, I start in all the same ways. What is your declaration?
I declare that I will continue to seek, as I have in the past, to maintain my spiritual age at 26. I think everybody has an internal age, right? Which has nothing to do with their years, but how do you feel? What is your spiritual age? And actually for years have thought, you know what? It's been 26 and every once in a while I check back and it continues to be 26. And I realize that I like being 26 because in doing that, you're continuing to look forward and you're continuing to look around and you're continuing to stay open-minded and curious, which is really what I want to do. And so that's my declaration.
So to maintain your spiritual age of 26, if I understood properly, it sounds that you picked 26 in part because of the pull towards the future. That's what you said, right? Looking ahead and looking around. But you didn't pick a teenage year. You picked young adulthood. And is that because you're fully formed? You have a better sense of what's happening? Is that why you picked it? It's a more mature year and yet still so much future ahead of you?
Well, it ties to how you feel. That's the number that came to me.
We'll come back because if you're picking the spiritual age of 26, you're clearly pulling, as we said, towards the future. And so let's come back to the future that you are envisioning and the future that you are aspiring towards. But before, let's actually go back to even earlier. If my memory serves, you were born to immigrant parents, one from Germany, one from Chile, and that probably shaped some of your outcomes, some of your view on life. How did it shape you? Tell us about growing up, where you grew up, and how that shaped ultimately who you became.
I think my experience was, once I came upon the term third culture kid, which I think I might have first come upon really when the Obama phenomenon was coming about, but it clicked because I was raised by parents who had accents, and I grew up in a small town, Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. And in lots of ways, we were just different, right? So you grow up with a sense of being different. At the same time, my primary motivation was to be the all-American kid. So I was really into sports and doing all the things that all-American kids do. But in retrospect, clearly what it was as well was you're just very aware of differences. You're aware of how you're different. It's classically talked about how you're never fully comfortable or at home in any setting, but at the same time, you're always thinking about other perspectives, right? And so I think it sensitizes you in a way which at the time I was not really aware of, but certainly as I reflect on my career, it was very profoundly important in the different choices I made and how it might have played successfully with what came about.
Let's start to get into that. I mean, obviously, after growing up in Swarthmore, you then went to Princeton. So for those who don't know, Michael and I both studied at Princeton, although not at the same time. What was it that you studied there? And did you think when you were there that ultimately it would be a mix of real estate and technology?
No, I started out briefly, I majored in architecture, but I couldn't draw. So that was hopeless. You really had to be able to draw then because there was no CAD, there was no computer assisted design at that point. But really what emerged was just an interest in cities. I was interested in cities. That took me into grad school in city planning and subsequently into city government in New York in economic development. Initially, my interest was more in policy, in cities. Cities to me were just a place where the future comes into being, right? Social, economic, and physical trends are coming into cities which are ever evolved. And so it's like ultimately dynamic in terms of just a place that ties all types of social and economic phenomena together in a physical manifestation. That's where my intellectual interest was. That led me into cities, into city government, which led me into built environment.
Well, and talk about the experience that you had in city government. I mean, ultimately, you mentioned cities being dynamic. You arguably went to the most dynamic city in the world. You worked at New York City for the Public Development Corporation for New York City, which is a division of the economic development arm. Arguably at the time, that was probably the most innovative or dynamic portion of city government as well. And obviously the alumni network is fantastic. And the amount of work that group has been able to do, both in New York and elsewhere in the world, is really historic. How do you feel that experience working within city government, but with an eye towards developing the broader city, the broader community? How do you think that has shaped your worldview?
To begin with, it gave me a full grounding in the public interest. I've always been really driven by working on big, impactful real estate. So city center, big stuff, which generally should be done with an eye towards what is the public interest in this? What would the public be looking for in a project here? And understanding that and working that into your plans for the project is a very logical thing to do rather than, approach it sort of like, well, okay, we got to get our approvals. What do we have to do to get our approvals? It's like to approach that same question proactively and solve for the right answer is a better approach.
You seem to be implying that while maybe the rest of the world doesn't always see it this way, you actually think there's great alignment between the public good and the economic interests of a thoughtful developer. Is that?
Yeah, there can and should be. I mean, I've always believed there's such a thing as good development, and I think most people would acknowledge that as well. You can't be dogmatically opposed or in favor of any type of development. It's got to be done with an eye towards where it sits, what happens in adjacent communities, and how are you benefiting all? And clearly, how are you creating value? Generally, you're creating value by creating a place where people want to be or come to and find experience, find each other, and that drives value.
It's such a fascinating point, and yet actually relatively controversial. I mean, it explains, if you think about the divide that we have in many cities around the country, we have a tremendous need for housing, particularly of the affordable sort. And we have a political situation that seems to have legs around supportive housing in the sense that there's anger about developers and there's this desire to keep rents low. And yet, it seems to me, as a sort of perhaps biased observer, that one of the best answers would be to actually encourage or allow more supply. Ezra Klein wrote a new book, Abundance, talking about this. You seem to think that that is logical, if I'm hearing you right. And so why is it therefore controversial?
It's controversial because clearly development and planning has to mediate between broader needs and hyperlocal concerns. So NIMBY is a problem that stands in the way of meeting broader needs. Supply needs to be created in the interests of the greater need, and housing is clearly a key central example of that. Another is even more unfathomable, but we all know and we're facing the need for more energy at a time when we really are limited by the capacity of the grid in this country. And we really have not been willing to take on an obvious need to solve for that, right? Which means essentially overriding local concerns and recognizing there's a greater need that everybody benefits from solving.
So those are examples where development could be for the public good. That's super interesting. Let's go back to your own personal evolution. You were in the public sector, as we said, working for New York City, and then ultimately made the switch to the private sector, where you joined Tishman Speyer. And while you joined Tishman Speyer originally in New York City, you didn't really last very long within New York. You quite quickly moved to Europe. And I think that was around the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Why don't you maybe just describe a little bit about the arc of your career and how you thought that there were similarities and differences of the public sector and private sector?
I worked when Ed Koch was mayor, and when he was on his way out, I started talking to people, and I spoke with Jerry Speyer, who at that time was thinking, could a U.S. real estate group work internationally? And again, that for the first time, because throughout my studies, the fact that I had been first American born in my family was irrelevant. I didn't study abroad. I was, again, back to the all-American kid. I was interested in U.S. cities, didn't really study anything outside the U.S. But I did grow up with German and Spanish. And I did, when I met Jerry and started talking about that challenge, it seemed really interesting to me. And I really liked the company and everybody I met at the company. And so I joined, initially based in New York, but traveling specifically to try to see what we could make happen overseas. And I was initially spending more time in Spain. But when the Berlin Wall fell, I started to spend time there. And we succeeded to win one of the first major competitions that they had after the fall of the wall. And my mother had been born 60 miles from there. It was just an ultimate challenge. Berlin, after the fall of the wall, was like super exciting, and probably of any city during our lifetimes was experiencing something historic.
One of the projects that you did is a true, very large scale, mixed use city center developments. That's sort of an example, perhaps a prototype of what you said is a good development that marries private sector interest with the public good. So let's spend a minute on that, but I'd like you to loop in a more broad view of Berlin for those who maybe are too young to remember how transformative it was for the Berlin Wall to have fallen. I think it's worth reminding the psychology was also that Berlin, it was so transformative, but it created this environment where everyone thought Berlin was going to grow. It was going to be the biggest city in Europe. It was going to be the best thing that happened since sliced bread, so they say. And it resulted in a lot of development. Did it all work? And so maybe just what are the lessons from all that?
Yeah. No. So the world descended on Berlin, which was really, West Berlin was an island. It was literally surrounded by East Germany, and its population was maintained and, in fact, built up by the fact that the West German government didn't require any military service if you were living in West Berlin, gave you free university education, 70% of the housing was subsidized. So West Berliners were used to a very nice paradise where, for the first time in my life, encountered, and still have never encountered anywhere else, to a West Berliner, the typical monthly budget didn't have your housing costs as your first expense. It was your car. Your rent was lower than your car, right? So that sort of set, in terms of just a a housing market that was a little bit distorted. The norm in the minds of Berliners was that your rent shouldn't be your greatest monthly expense. But the world descended on Berlin. You couldn't find any place to live. You couldn't find an office. The hotels were booked. It was absolute madness, and it was super exciting. Rents tripled in an 18-month period after the fall of the wall. And so land prices, of course, acted accordingly, and development geared up because the German banks, which were at that time, it wasn't uncommon for there to be 100% financing of projects. So the 1992 annual report from JLL projected rents in Berlin would be 120 Deutschmarks. It's about 60 euros today. And we at least had the presence of mind to recognize. So our first project was actually dead center in Berlin. We won this competition, and we underwrote rents for that project would be at, I think it was 68 Deutschmarks. And JLL had said peak rents 120 Deutschmarks. So we were prudent, conservative, and we delivered 1994, and market still wasn't at 68. It was lower. It just showed the violence of a real estate cycle where, especially in a place which was basically, it went from being a place where there was very little development suddenly to a place which was the center of a huge amount of development focus. And yes, the oversupply tanked that market for close to 20 years.
So what are the lessons now? Are there areas where you see a tremendous amount of oversupply that we should all be scared of? Or fundamentally, have we as a development or real estate investment community gotten better at projecting demand and matching it to supply? Or do you still think that that creates distortions that are investable?
It's always tricky. There's always going to be a cycle, and the cycle is going to be usually driven by supply, I mean, and normally the trouble is traditionally the cycle is driven by confidence, and confidence in terms of real estate development, which you have to think, okay, it's 3 years from when you pull the trigger to when you're delivering space, give or take, right? Oftentimes, if you're celebrating when you start a project, you should actually not be celebrating. You should know you're too late. If you're not sick to your stomach when you start a project, you're probably too late. You should be sick to your stomach when you start a project in real estate.
We'll come back to that. I think one of the things I've learned from you is how to read the cycle. So let's come back to that. But let's just stick maybe a little more broadly in you personally at Tishman Speyer. So you spent 30 years there. That's obviously where I got to know you. And you helped them lead expansion, not just to Europe, to Berlin, as you said, but it was Berlin, the rest of Europe, and then ultimately around the globe. So just as you think about your arc, what were the key leadership principles that you think guided you, that helped you lead an organization like this? And how has that helped influence not just the organization that you ran, but maybe more broadly, the investment philosophy from the people that you taught?
Yeah, look, especially if you're going to be investing or building businesses internationally, it starts with needing to read the differences, right? Not just the consumer differences. What is the cultural preference when it comes to, in this case, real estate offices or shops or living? How do people, exist in spaces? And that's always different within different cultures, but also in building teams. What was the pre-existing structure of the industry? How do people think? Especially at that time in Europe, most of real estate was more of a fee-driven business, right? You had institutions that would buy in advance buildings from contractors who would basically, their profit was defined by the difference between what they'd already sold the building for and what it ended up costing. So it wasn't a perfect alignment in terms of delivering buildings that were sustainable in terms of performance.
You think that's different now? You think it's less of a fee business and more of an equity investment business now?
I think there's been a huge transformation in terms of, I think real estate is truly globalized in many ways. And so I think by now it is quite different. Yeah. But you still find merchant building all over the place. But I think you also find that capital understands much better where there can be misalignments and where you need to be careful.
Yeah, that's true. Although I will acknowledge, I still see, and particularly, I spent, as 20 some years as an operator and sort of switched now really, invest capital and mostly with other operators. So we do some on our own. And I continue to think that there are many, many operators within the real estate universe for whom fees matter far more than equity profit. I do think that contributes to the cycle that you were talking about.
That was the case then. And one of the things that we had to work very hard on was to actually explain the way to look at things through an equity lens, right? Through the capital, right?
Well, one of the things that I remember, and this is a lesson that will always stick with me, is that you were, when thinking about the capital or acting as a fiduciary for the capital, you were always willing to express an independent view. And so I remember in 2005, 2006, you suggested that we collectively step back and think that while everybody else seems to be getting ever more aggressive about pricing and thinking it's always going to go up, that perhaps we already owned enough. And if that bet were right, we would continue to make it on our portfolio. But that in fact, maybe we should start to think about what could go wrong. And that in case bullish sentiment maybe was going too far, we should start to sell. Separately, I remember, and this is what you said about being sick to your stomach in development, I remember that after that period, there was a time when development sentiment was about as bad as it had ever been, or at least in my experience in London, and that you thought that negative sentiment was peaking and that it was not likely to get much worse. And so you correctly predicted that rents would actually rise if we were to start a development project. And boy, you were right. To what do you attribute your ability to have done this, to uncover these contrarian sentiments and then to have the fortitude, the courage to communicate them and to act upon them?
I think the nature of the cycle, and again, it's back to this dilemma. You always have to be thinking ahead in terms of the real estate cycle, especially given the time it takes for supply to come online, right? And during good times, that's the time to really keep an eye on how much supply is building, because the demand side will taper. At some point, there will be recession, there will be a slowdown. But on the flip side, after that oversupply has hit and rents collapse and nobody's going to build, everybody shuts down. That's the perfect time to start. Because if you can be among the first developments to go as demand rebuilds, you've got this 1-2 year advantage. You're the first or the early to market, when actually it's always the larger, higher quality spaces that initially get fully absorbed. Then rents start to really drive higher. You want to be positioned that way.
So
right?
Can't help but wonder, where are we now? And it may depend, right? There may be a different cycle at this time, perhaps unique among prior cycles. It may be different in the office sector, let's say, than in the multifamily sector or the data center sector. They may all three have different answers, but maybe if you're willing to venture a guess, where do you think we are now in some of these sectors?
Well, first of all, I think what's most interesting is I think that these days, everything is mixed use, right? I think that one of the things that's in the process of being transformed is that real assets are considered, single use assets, right? I think that, interestingly, as clearly we've been through COVID and that had, severe impacts on many center cities. And as those center cities are starting to reconsider, I spent some time in San Francisco, which of course was probably the poster child. And clearly a major push there is to, in fact, encourage all uses in all buildings. And from a regulatory standpoint, make it easier to change use in buildings, right? I think that all cities are headed in that direction. It makes perfect sense, because the stronger you diversify the core of any city, the better it is within that city. I mean, the broader interest is in, these are places where we've invested heavily in mass transportation, other ways for people to get around. So we better figure out a way to make use of those buildings, right? And cities shouldn't stand in the way in any way. And many cities still have on the books regs that make no sense. Why do you really need, or why would you want to encourage single uses in buildings? Life safety concerns need to be addressed. But other than that, there shouldn't be any public interest in preventing reuse of buildings.
But does that imply just that as a major public policy initiative, it will largely be a conversion of office space downtown to other uses, principally residential? Is that the big trend that you see?
Some of that, I think whether fully or partially. I mean, the partially bit is sort of interesting, right? It's depending on the cities. You have a lot of people who have new types of housing that have been created for shorter stays, shorter uses, which starts to blend with hotel use. These days, I think that's part of this, right? The blending of uses means that a multifamily building, and what's the difference between a multifamily building and a hotel these days? Well, a lot depends on what the local regulations are as to short-term rental, but in fact, the two can be used the same way.
Hi, this is Todd Rich. Thank you for listening to the Declarations Podcast, where top investors and business leaders share their insights and provide an independent perspective. We hope you're enjoying this episode. If you'd like to learn more about Declaration Partners or listen to more episodes of the Declarations Podcast, please visit our website at www.declarationpartners.com. And now back to the episode. It's interesting, not just the local regulations. I mean, there's a difference in how they get financed as well, right? With the principal difference being, the government agencies. They may be more broad from housing. I mean, I still remember when you and I were working together. I mean, Class A real estate, and especially office buildings, not only were they single use, but they were austere, right? They were almost museum pieces. They were sort of cold and maybe even intimidating. And it no longer feels that way, right? It feels like design has evolved to infuse more hospitality-like elements, even into a traditional office lobby. I think that creates more of a retail feel. There's more of a flow. And in the same way that you said shorter term rentals might be happening in housing, it looks like hotels. I would argue the same thing happened in office buildings, right? With WeWork and Industrious Convene all moving towards shorter term leases, more of a hospitality focus. I imagine that's something that you know a thing or two about. I mean, you sort of led Tishman Speyer in this direction as head of innovation, right? Talk about what you saw happening there.
The office building business, historically, it's great business. You create a great building, you get a great credit tenant to sign a long lease, and you basically have an annuity stream, right? And that has been the business. And actually, some of the most satisfying work I've done in my career was the point at which you're actually creating a new headquarters for an organization. Because it's way beyond just the lease. If they're planning a new headquarters building, in the old days, that's the one time when they would be thinking most strategically about their business, right? What are their business units? How are each of their business units going to be growing over coming years? How do they need to be configured? Who should be in close proximity to whom? All those things are really super interesting. And that's the way the customer in real estate has been thinking if you're an office owner. And thinking about that, you realize that oftentimes they're not being given options to deal with the liabilities that they're creating on their own balance sheet by signing these long leases, right? And the world changes. The business cycle always changes. And oftentimes they're long space or short space. How do they deal with that, right? So the phenomenon of tolerating short-term rentals, which I credit WeWork and the co-working phenomenon with addressing that. And, what they did it initially for was to meet the needs of very small, basically startups that had no credit, who most landlords really didn't want to be leasing to or bothering to sign leases for a few rooms. And they aggregated that demand. And that would have been a beautiful business in and of itself. But of course, the rest is history. But the signaling was there, certainly from a Tishman Speyer perspective. In the earliest days, we were happy to be leasing to WeWork. Then at some point, as they were pushing their valuation, it was, whoa, these guys are not stopping at startups. They're going after everybody. And why should you allow for the disintermediation of your customer? You want to maintain that contact.
So how did you respond?
It was actually you can imagine from the perspective of, okay, you're in the business of signing long-term leases for buildings that banks have no problem giving, valuing. And then you're talking about going into shorter-term leases. Are you out of your mind? No, it's like, no, but you think about a building, most buildings you're underwriting in any case with a certain degree of structural vacancy, for example. So why don't you just take that piece of vacancy and start to experiment, do some short-term renting in space that you've even assumed wouldn't be generating much revenue, start there and see what happens, which is basically what we did. So we started within Rock Center initially, but again, if you build out floor by floor to allow for finished, furnished space that then is available on short-term you then you're reaching a whole segment of the market that you weren't reaching before. And then, of course, through COVID, that became a very important means of accommodating most decisions as things emerged post-COVID, where no company wanted to be making long-term decisions of any kind because they really didn't know what they would be needing in terms of their real estate. And many were comfortable initially with shorter-term decisions.
But I actually think you did more than that, right? I mean, there's one thing which is to accommodate this shorter term decision making, but I actually think those spaces allowed you to offer innovative amenities, right? That were just different from what people originally expected or used to expect from office buildings, right? Whether it's gyms or nap rooms, or you'll remember more of them than I will.
One of the things that starts to get into, okay, so when mobile technology put into each of our hands the ability to connect with services, that transforms the potential for any building, right? So back to the mixed use nature of buildings, we are all as individuals, when we're working from home or homing from work, we can be buying stuff in the office to pick up on the way home. We can be making doctor's appointments or doing whatever we need to be doing from wherever we are. The mobile technology allowed you to create the digital platform to connect, from a landlord's perspective, to connect the people in your buildings to the services that they want. And if you can really enable that, you're facilitating greater satisfaction for people in their workplace. That's a full alignment between the landlord and the tenant.
Well, what's fascinating is actually when you describe it that way, it becomes a better product, right? You have now solved the customer's needs in a different way, and you've offered them something that in theory they should value and therefore be willing to pay for. And yet, with all that innovation, investors have collectively lost billions of billions in the office sector. So what happened? What went wrong?
Just like in a cycle, for the moment, they've lost billions of dollars, and the office business has changed. What's really happening is that the nature of demand for office, yes, there's all kinds of things that are dampening probably the total quantum of demand and have moved an increasing portion of that demand into a shorter term rental, because that's a better solution for the occupier. But so if you're owning real estate or office buildings, it behooves you to meet both needs, right? Or meet all needs, right? And so it's become more of an operating business than it ever was. And so that's trickier. I really have come to think of office buildings, if you're operating the building well, you should be thinking of it as a shared services platform for the occupants of that building. Now, you might have within a single building 20 different companies, oftentimes having the same needs that they're each going out individually and trying to procure solutions for. And you, at the same time, you control and can drive a better logistical solution for all types of needs. So yeah, if you can block time with a medical service provider to be operating within the building so that people can go and book hours for medical appointments, basic stuff in the building, or to book access to personal shoppers, or to book temporary help, right? All these things bring value to those companies and those buildings. And so it becomes part of a package, which is much more than just what are you paying per square foot for the rent.
That in some ways explains the ever widening gap between the winners and the losers, right? Between those buildings that can command premium rents because they provide a better product, a better service, and those buildings that are probably moving towards obsolescence. I think that's fascinating. Despite those fascinating changes, you don't seem to be spending much of your personal time looking for new office opportunities. Instead, you seem to have transitioned really into an investor in venture, technology. You often work with companies. You often work as an advisor to young entrepreneurs, right? The people creating these solutions. So just talk about your transition into the world of technology and innovation and what excites you about that world.
Look, I retired from Tishman Speyer now over 5 years ago, and actually wanted to just spend my time on things that interest me. And that generally, as I've reflected on things, what I really have enjoyed most is ideas, developing ideas, and growing people and ideas. And all business, all investing, if you can be close to the creation of and building of ideas and talent, huge value is being created. You should participate in that in any way that you can. It's certainly not because I haven't wanted to be doing real estate. That's still very much runs in my blood. But the fact is, I have been finding more interest in working with early stage businesses and growing them, as opposed to focusing on acquiring or improving large assets. I think as the cycle has moved on, I also engage with early stage investment platforms that are entering into real estate. One of the more interesting things these days is if you really understand what technology can bring to real estate, how would you build a new business, whether it's around asset management or development? And I find that a very interesting proposition. And I know, there are a number of teams that are out there doing that, and certainly they're going to succeed in doing it. And at the same time, I spend some time with larger incumbents who are also very focused on adopting technology, trying to become more efficient. And of course, for any larger operation that's used to working in a certain way, that's not easy.
When you're working with this level of change, right, and you're seeking out entrepreneurs who are trying to do something new, I imagine you meet some people who are extraordinarily talented and some who are less so, or some who may have talent, but they have a misguided vision. How do you sort through the people who have what it takes, the ideas or the people that are worth backing? How do you figure that out?
Well, you have to spend time with the people for sure. I guess on the first level, you sort of are sifting through. There's a certain amount of dream in all entrepreneurs, right? So how much of this is a dream and how much of this is actually somebody who actually has figured out how you're going to get there, right? And that how you figure out how to get there requires intensity, it requires intelligence, it requires, is this somebody personable? Is this somebody who can work with other people? Is this somebody who thinks the world revolves around them and is sort of a classic hero founder who can fly very high? But I tend to like people who have given thought to themselves and what are the skill sets in others that complement who they are, right? And how are they going to build a team and build success? Because that's fundamental and that's critical. And a lot of what I actually really enjoy doing in so many different international places is finding people who likewise could be woven together and build collectively businesses, right? Successfully, right? So that's the same challenge that many entrepreneurs now find in building their own businesses, which happen to be around technology. And by the way, I'm not bringing much to them in terms of any true expertise around the technology. I'm simply somebody who likes to think strategically about the implications of that technology for the real estate business, right? So that's something that I find very exciting. But they're the ones who know the technology. They oftentimes are baffled by the mentality of and how their customer is going to respond or react to the value proposition that they're bringing.
So that might sort of lead into then the question of so not only how do you identify them, it sounds like you have some criteria, but how do you influence them? What is it about your style, your expertise that allows you to mentor these entrepreneurs? And what do you see out of them? How do you know that you've been able to positively impact or develop them in a way that will lead to a good outcome?
I'm generally pretty low key, so I listen a lot. I don't really say things unless I have something to say. But when I have something to say, I think people find value in what I have to say. I think the recurring themes that I tend to come back to with a lot of founders is really the human capital side of the equation. Do they have the right people to achieve what they need to achieve? And, in the earliest stages, they're, of course, being pulled in all directions. And the thing that they find it the hardest is to find the time to think strategically about how they want to build the capacity to be in a year where they're going to need to be in terms of others who can pick up for some of the stuff that they're continuing to take on themselves. So the offloading is always a continuing challenge for any entrepreneur. And I think they find value in having somebody help them figure that out. And likewise, more broadly within teams is how do you get teams to think about ways to work together and not be pulling in different directions. And a lot of that is just around clearly identifying your objectives and communicating clearly around those.
I can't help but acknowledge that you're focusing really on entrepreneurs in the technology sector, and yet your principal conclusions and advice revolve around human capital and harnessing it. We're in a world where AI is the latest buzzword. How do you think the use of AI technology will ultimately change that? Will it limit the importance of human capital? How do you see change coming through the use of artificial intelligence?
In real estate, I mean, I've given a lot of thought to this. I think what's super interesting is that right now, everybody's trying to figure out what it is and how can they embed it in their own business or build upon it in the future. Everybody's got to recognize that in real estate organizations, there are specific profiles that have been established based on the way the whole industry has been organized. So a project manager who is engaged in everything from the design through the construction and the organization of the whole thing, that's very much been somebody who's well organized, is generally good with people, but also really strong and tough, right? It's totally relationship driven. The industry's never fully understood the risk in construction. Nobody has, because nobody's bothered to be able to harness all the data that's come out of everything that's been built historically. That is in the process of being done now, so that in the future, the project manager who actually has at their disposal agents who are able to put data in front of them to sort of point them in advance to where there may be looming risks, where they should be spending their time. Totally different proposition. And there needs to be a whole new generation of project managers who will be oriented towards the data as a means to making the judgments that need to be made on site. Likewise, even more so with an asset manager and a real estate organization, right? Has also, while they are slightly more data oriented, they still don't really make judgments on the basis of data. They make judgments on the basis of what they hear from brokers or other intermediaries who interpret anecdotal data, but haven't actually been able to put real analysis to clean data. And that's all changing. So the asset manager of the future, how many assets could a young Todd Rich manage in the future?
With more data and less reliance on broker speak? Probably quite a few.
That's right. And so that hasn't been lost on most major real estate organizations, and certainly it hasn't been lost on younger ones who are figuring they can build a more efficient, profitable competitor.
It's fascinating. And back to construction, I mean, to the extent that we as an industry can figure out a way to harness the power of more efficient, more productive construction work, that should really help to bend the cost curve. We've spent a lot of time trying to think about what innovative construction methodologies or technologies we could employ in order to try and make housing more affordable. We have yet to find one that works clearly and easily in multiple jurisdictions. But whoever's able to solve that, there are a couple of people out there who are trying hard, but whoever's able to solve that, I think, is really going to have a positive impact on the world.
I agree. And I think inevitably it is going to happen.
Well, if you hear about it, tell us first.
I think I know the models that will succeed. I don't know that they need to. I tend to think there will be geographic concentrations of solutions, right? Rather than single solutions that will be the answer in multiple or across the board.
And you think that just because of the difficulty of dealing with different jurisdictional zoning requirements or the difficulty of transporting components of construction over large distances?
I mean, elements of all that. Look, the solution is going to be in standardization, right? The best way to standardize is to, in fact, create modular solutions or component parts that can be simply assembled as opposed to constructed in the traditional way is the answer. And the fact is, the design of those component parts can be centralized. The production of those component parts can be centralized. I think a key role will be played by municipalities here, where they will basically agree that they can figure out a way to pre-approve the component parts and the assembly mechanisms. And
from
that
a building code perspective, you're saying.
Right. And that will drive the whole market into that solution, right? And that's the way to drive down the cost.
I'm fascinated. We can continue this conversation offline, but we have looked at many of those solutions and are spending, more time on some than others. We have yet to find one that consistently is able to demonstrate that approach will in fact be less expensive and or faster. The holy grail, right, is better, cheaper, faster, right? And if you could find one that were in fact better and cheaper and faster, it would win. But we have struggled to find the one that is in fact all three of those things. And therefore, traditional construction methodology still seems to win out. Now, as you and I both know, development economics are pretty challenged at the moment. And so innovation may be closer than farther. I certainly hope that's the case.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you can't have, most of the trouble for the startups has been that they have so far sought to control too much of the supply chain and the means of production, right? And actually, that's the piece that requires different ownership. Inevitably, I think there's going to be a public role in that ownership of that factory that produces that stuff. If you really want to drive down costs, that's how you do it.
We'll come to that, but let's stay on the notion of what makes development great. Through your role with the Urban Land Institute, you have always been a champion for great development and recognizing differentiated projects. I think you were one of the initiators of what they call the Art in Place initiative, which is to try and marry great design with art, with the public experience of development projects. So can you tell me a little bit more about that and why you always thought that recognizing development through awards and why integrating art was always important to you?
Well, look, through my career, Jerry Speyer he's an art guy as well as a real estate guy. And I think through that, the real pleasure in developing major projects has been to think about, okay, how could you incorporate something that is noteworthy and provocative, and sort of draws public interest. And so that was something that was fun to do as part of many projects over the years. And meeting artists too, who think differently, I think that they bring real value. Within ULI, at some point, I met a Dutch artist whose work was in sort of going into communities, spending time in communities. And one of them was Liverpool. She went into a part of Liverpool that had been demolished to make way for a new football stadium in the 80s, and it stayed that way for decades. There was not much there. And she went in there and she decided, okay, my art project is going to be to create a bakery with the community. So it actually ended up being a little mini economic development project. In that case, she called it a piece of art, but what it did within that community was pretty magical in terms of it was a seed that got planted that actually led to other things happening in ways that are really interesting. I also met in Chicago, I was chairing the awards jury at ULI for, visionaries in urban development. And Piester Gates is an artist on the south side of Chicago who actually studied urban planning. And I think of him as a developer as much as an artist, because what he's been able to do there in terms of reusing old buildings, turning them into libraries or clubs or other things that become embedded within the communities, that too just struck a chord with me. So a few years ago when ULI had a capital campaign, and I thought, well, I'm interested in doing something around this theme. And it's always bothered me that I find too many young developers these days are always very oriented towards the numbers, but they aren't actually thinking about or really focused on creating interest in the spaces that are being created.
Too mired in a spreadsheet to think about how the space will ultimately get used.
Right. And so you can feel good because a broker said, oh, the rent on something is going to be X. And the bank says, okay, that's good. Check the box. That sounds, I've seen that work elsewhere. So I'm okay funding that. But that's actually not how you really move the needle. So the idea of bringing an artist in at the earliest stages in the conception of a project, I think, is interesting. And that's what the idea is behind Art in Place, which now it's been like 12 different districts within ULI globally who have engaged and come up with different projects around that theme. It is experimental. It's to see where it goes. But it actually, I think, is to get people thinking about the possibility. And it sounds a little bit crazy, but I don't think developers and artists are that different in the way they think about things. If you're thinking about what succeeds in development, it's bringing, again, back to people. If you can create a place where people want to go be with other people, in some way, you're creating value. You just have to do that in a way that's successful and feasible. Right.
Well, in so many ways, that comes back to where we started, which is that this is about infusing some element of public good into a development. And in your own work, your philanthropic work, I guess, you have often focused on how government policy can influence the built environment. And I know you spent a bunch of time at the Kennedy School at Harvard. I believe it's the Taubman Center to talk about state and local governments. How do you think that state and local governments can use effective policy choices to make positive difference in that community?
I guess in terms of how my extracurriculars I have maintained throughout an interest in local government because I think that's where there's immediate impact, right? And there's all kinds of, back on the same themes of technology, and in so many ways, there are so many ways in which local government is looking at becoming more effective. A lot of that does appear and is interesting to stay close to through involvement with the Taubman Center at Kennedy School, which I've enjoyed doing. Separately, I kept active internationally in terms of international development through an organization called TechnoServe, which works in the developing world, a lot on agriculture, but also a lot on entrepreneurship and sort of working in cities in major cities in Africa, Latin America, India. It's active in like 30 different countries. And that too has been very satisfying to me. So I like spending time on that too.
Well, all of these things have some sort of a pull towards the future. So let's go back. Your spiritual age is 26, or I guess that's what you'd like. You'd like to maintain a spiritual age of 26. So as a 26-year-old spiritually, what are your dreams? What are you aspiring towards now?
It's really funny because it's obviously a really tricky time in the world. And I think many of us with kids who look at things as real 26-year-olds, or in my case, even older, with real questions about stuff, that can become overwhelming, right? And my advice to them at that point is focus on the things you can touch, right? And make a difference as you can in things you can touch. And I find that is the best way to sort of calm down the noise, right? And so I practice that myself too. So I find myself truly orienting myself towards quieter things. That I think keeps me in a position to just still think about stuff going forward. But, I will always be active, but a lot of that activity is conceptual, it's strategic, and I can always do that. It probably will become more and more challenging to consider myself spiritually 26, but it's a low bar. I just say, how do you feel? And I still feel 26.
Good. Well, it's come time, Michael, for us to do our standard closing questions. What is a book that most influenced your thinking or personal development?
Well, given all we've talked about it, the single book would have to be The Power Broker, Robert Caro. It's a masterful work. It's not that I actually emulate or consider Robert Moses to be, a great man, but he really figured out how to get stuff done, right?
And transformed the city of New York and the surrounding areas.
Right. And not without controversy and not without real flaws, but the real point is he figured out how to get stuff done. And I think that that's essential. And I think these days, one of the real crises around lots of things is the belief in the ability to get stuff done, right? So I think that was a great book. It just showed how you have to corral a lot of forces, some against you, some that you can start to ride and make things happen in order to achieve meaningful impact.
The best advice you received from your parents or that you give to your own kids?
Well, this is a topic for another podcast, but I would not have done what I'm doing. My father was a college professor, right? So his advice would have taken me in a totally different direction. The fact is I rejected it all. So much to his consternation. And my kids actually have ended up being very different from me. But my advice to them has always been, my father was probably very pleased to see me pursue my passion, right? You have to just figure out what really excites you and go for it. So my advice to my kids has always been, whatever you do, keep your finger on the pulse of what really excites you, what drives you, what are you passionate about?
So, Michael, as you know, the Declaration of Independence talks about the freedom for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What do you do in pursuit of happiness?
Well, I love natural setting. I'm increasingly drawn to getting out into the hills, doing some hiking, ideally with friends and family. It's about a lot of little things. I feel like I just like small pleasures, and that's what I'm pursuing, and that makes me happy.
Thank you for your participation today. As always, I feel like I learned a ton, and I feel like I have left with even more questions. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for your mentorship. And obviously, thank you for today's podcast.
Thanks, Todd. It was great. Thank you.
This podcast is provided for discussion and informational purposes only, for use by Declaration Partners, LP, together with its affiliates, referred to as Declaration. The information discussed in this podcast may change at any time without notice, and there is no duty by Declaration to update any person to whom this information is provided. This podcast does not constitute an offer to sell or the solicitation of an offer to purchase any investment product or any interest in the fund or any other investment vehicles or accounts managed or advised by Declaration, a Declaration investment product, in any jurisdiction to any person. Any such offer or solicitation for interest in any Declaration investment product will only be made pursuant to such Declaration investment product's definitive offering documents, which contain a description of the material terms, including risk factors, conflicts of interest, fees and charges, and regulatory and tax considerations relating to such Declaration investment product, and which should be reviewed carefully by potential investors prior to making an investment decision. This podcast does not constitute tax or legal advice. The listener is urged to consult a professional tax and/or legal advisors regarding the possible tax, legal, economic, regulatory, or other risks and consequences associated with any investment, and must be able to bear the risks involved. This podcast may contain certain forward-looking statements which constitute Declaration's views with respect to future events, which can be identified by the use of forward-looking terminology such as intend, seek, expect, target, project, or endeavor. These statements are made based upon such views as they exist as of the date herein. There is no assurance that such views are correct or will prove, with the passage of time, to be correct. Actual events or results may differ materially from those contemplated by such forward-looking statements as a result of factors beyond Declaration's control, including, without limitation, any disruptions in global, regional, or local financial, credit, or real estate markets, acts of God, fire, hurricanes, tropical storms, floods, earthquakes, or other natural disasters, outbreaks of an infectious disease, pandemic, or any other serious public health concern, war, terrorism, labor strikes, electricity shortages, or other national or local emergencies, or any combination of the foregoing. David M. Rubenstein is an anchor investor in Declaration Partners Real Estate Fund II and is not an employee of Declaration. Neither the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission nor the Securities Regulatory Authority of any state or other jurisdiction has passed upon the accuracy or adequacy of this podcast. No compensation has been awarded to any speaker for statements made that are either testimonials or endorsements. However, certain speakers may be current or former investors in certain Declaration investment products and may receive reduced fees, priority terms, priority access, co-investment rates, among other preferential treatment, which may pose a conflict of interest. Certain speakers may also be affiliates and/or service providers that receive compensation from Declaration for services provided in their service provider capacity, but have not been compensated specifically for any testimonials or endorsements made herein. All statements made on the podcast are the opinions and beliefs of the speaker and may not necessarily represent the opinions, beliefs, and position of Declaration. Consequently, from the foregoing, no reliance whatsoever should be placed on this podcast, and no decision including any investment decision should be made based on this podcast or on the information contained herein.